So, welcome everyone. We're very pleased with the interest that we're seeing as we've had over 450 registrations for this webinar. And this webinar is part of the 4th European Safer Gambling Week. So this week, there was a social media campaign across Europe led by the EGBA members with safer gambling messages in over 20 languages. And you can follow all the online discussions using the hashtag ESGW24. So there are more events lined up, and you can still see these on the EGBA website if you're interested. Next slide, please. And the next one. So we have an amazing lineup of speakers today. We have Simo Dragicevic, the founder of Game Safety Institute. We have Stacy Harper from Flutter UK and Ireland, who's the Senior Customer Safety Strategy Manager. And we have Eduards, and I won't even try to pronounce your surname, I'm so sorry, Head of Safer Gambling at Betsson Group. I got Dragicevic at least, so I'm quite happy with that. And we have Dr. Jonathan Parke, who's the director at Sophro. And I myself, I'm Maris, I'm the research consultant with Kindred Group at the moment. So to set off this discussion, and just before actually, it's just some housekeeping rules. So we encourage the audience to ask as many questions as they want through the chat function. The webinar will be recorded and the recording will be shared tomorrow. Now, to set off the discussion, EGBA has prepared a few slides on safer gambling tools based on the sustainability report that they publish annually. So I'll just go through these just to give a bit of a setting before we start the questions. So next slide. From what we see from the EGBA members, in 2023, 65% of all customers used at least one safer gambling tool. And that was an increase of 14% year on year. Now, obviously, when we report this type of data, we might ask, yes, but we see more regulators pushing for mandatory tools. But what the data showed is that over half of the users that use safer gambling tools use these voluntarily. Next slide. Something which was quite interesting was that in 2023, the deposit limits were still by far the most popular tool. So we've seen this as well in different research papers, that this is still something that customers really like. And again, 70% of the customers use this voluntarily. Next slide. Now, interestingly, almost half of the customers have actually used these tools voluntarily, and they were at least 35 years old or younger. So we see also quite a shift in the younger generation using these tools. Next slide. So with that in mind, let's start the panel discussion on safer gambling tools, innovations, effectiveness, and best practice. So I'll start asking some questions. And I think I'll start off with Eduards, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I think it's good that we have a mix here. So we have some operators, so you can give us more first-hand experience, but also academics, so we can get more information from that field. Now, when it comes to Betsson and when it comes to your experience, Edward, what do you see as recent innovations in safer gambling tools, and which of these are the most impactful and why?
Hi all, and thank you for having me first and foremost. So when it comes to the safer gambling tools, I'm inclined to break your question down into two parts, unfortunately. I don't want to overcomplicate things, but I think when it comes to the first part, if we only consider the traditional old school tools in a meaning of the tools that you have shown on those slides, such as deposit limits, timeouts, self-exclusions, or perhaps session limits as well, when it comes to those, I have a bit of a conservative view here, I would say, and I think rather than innovating, what I would advocate for is the educating. I think raising awareness, explaining, and making sure that the percentage of the use of those tools is increasing, I think that is the key element here rather than the innovation. Throughout the years, at, at Betsson, we have acquired a number of smaller operators, and some of them perhaps were, uh, you know, even on a very, on a forefront of offering a lots of tools to their customers. And we ran into situations where we saw operators with sometimes tens of different tools on the offer. Bet stake limit, bet limit, wagering limit for one product or the other product, and all those types of things. And we thought it's an amazing thing, and how cool is that? But once you start going deeper, my belief is that this has confused customers more than it actually helped those players. I have seen lots of players not understanding what they actually are putting on their accounts. I have seen lots of questions, customers being very confused about how exactly is this tool protecting them, what is it limiting, what it's not limiting. So when it comes to those old school traditional tools, I think as we saw the deposit limit being the most popular one, I think it's also one of the most reasonable ones. I think it's also one of the easier to understand ones. And I think it's the one that is the most crucial one, and the one that we should be educating people about, and the one that we should be explaining, and the one where we would look at increasing the use of that voluntary consumption of the limit. Because then, as you rightly said, Maris, there are regulators that enforce a deposit limit as a mandatory approach, and there are pros and cons to that, but clearly what we see is as a concern is that once it becomes a mandatory tool, lots of customers just put it on very high unreasonable levels. And that becomes a concern anyway. So you have 100% of customers having a deposit limit, but it's clearly not 100% of customers that are protected by that limit. Our belief, and my personal belief, is that those that use it voluntarily actually put a much more sensible limit that is actually protecting them to a large extent rather than something that does not protect them and makes no difference for them. So this is, and sorry for taking a bit of time, but this is one part of the answer on that traditional view of what the safer gambling tools are. When it comes to innovation, my belief is that if we expand that definition and if we include other types of uh, perhaps touch points with the players, this is where I believe there is a lot of space for innovation. Most importantly for me is when it comes to uh, various transparency related and raising awareness about so information related tools like reality checks, or maybe login information, how much you have spent on that particular session, or maybe the logout information, how you gambled. I think if we include that part of well, traditionally it's not a tool really, right? But if we include that into our definition of safer gambling tools, then I think this is the space where there is a lot of flexibility that operators have. And this is the space where we really can put in a lot of things in place that would really help the players to understand how they're gambling. And there is also the room for, machine learning and making relevant content and putting in place, information that is relevant for specifically those customers. So I think in my view, this is the area where we could discuss, various innovations. When it comes to the traditional tools, I'm a bit hesitant there and somewhat skeptical about, offering, just another tool for the sake of offering it.
I think you touched on a very good point as well, because at least this is from my experience. A lot of operators, when it comes to the RG page, it's more tick the box. So like I have to say gambling is harmful, I have to put in some RG tools, but then it's not that easy to understand. So even sometimes like there won't be information on what happens if you increase the limit, or how does the limit work? Some offer rolling, some offer calendar. Are there any
Indeed.
initiatives like that, for example, that you see? Or maybe Stacy, if you want to chip in as an operator, like maybe there's some initiatives to include more information. Like in Sweden, you have to set up time limits, but I've never seen an operator actually give information on how much time people are spending on their website. So how can they set up a proper time limit? I don't know if Edward or Stacy want to chip in a bit more on this.
Let me give the
Yes,
opportunity to the others as well.
yes, Stacy.
Yeah, so I agree. I think if there's opportunity to personalize and educate customers on how the tools may work best for them, I think that's something that's really important to do. So for time, I think that's quite a good example to be able to maybe even show customers data visualization of their own sort of activity to then kind of suggest a tool off the back of that. So we don't have anything in that kind of sense at the minute from a time perspective, but we do have a kind of profit and loss tool where we can show customers their level of spend, which you could then sort of direct customers potentially towards limits, based then on the information that you're giving to them there. So I agree kind of with Ed as well about that point around the education side is really important. So, it's not necessarily the case of developing loads more tools, but how can you educate customers on the ones that are there? How can we provide maybe more kind of ones that will help people with self-reflection? So more about data visualization and things like that, so people can then make informed choices about how they want to manage their gambling going forward.
We did get one question from the audience. So I'm just going to put it out there and I'll leave to see. Yes, Jonathan, you want to say something?
Yeah, just quickly to follow up on Edward's point about touch points. So I think it's very much the case that we should be focusing on accessibility of the tools as a priority as opposed to innovations in the tools themselves. So the way I would put it, maximize opportunities and minimize friction. So a really simple example of this would be, there's a variety of different communications. We have safer gambling messages, we have reality checks, we have activity statements, we have emails. And when I look at some of the main operators, sometimes there's no link to the responsible gambling page or no link to a deposit limit. So an obvious example would be if I'm looking at my activity statement, I see, wow, I've spent way too much this month. It would be really handy if there was a pretty clear link to be able to set a deposit limit. And I think that often demonstrates the intention. And as you say, Maris, it's always about, are you meeting the minimum requirements, which as unfortunately aren't always as specific and prescriptive as we'd like, or are we going above and beyond it? So, for example, this morning I got an email saying, here's a bonus. The biggest thing on the email by far was a big yellow claim button. So when it comes to, you're smiling at me. So when it comes to responsible gambling, I think it's important to make sure you're maximizing the opportunities and having the touch points, as Edward says. So if you're finding that you're spending more than you can afford, make it really easy to set up a deposit limit rather than having to click through 4 different pages. So it's getting some of the simple things right, I think.
Yeah, I think the one of my favorites was on a self-exclusion page. Like you had to do so many clicks, and you also had like a banner. We're so sad to see you go. I'm like, okay, this is going to be quite difficult for someone to just self-exclude. We have a question from the audience, which I'll ask and I'll leave anyone who wants to answer it. So, does the panel think that customer education should include a clear warning that gambling is addictive to make it obvious why they should use the tools?
I think so, for sure. I mean, this is something that operators, I think, I mean, it's a common knowledge at this stage, I believe. And well, I hope so. So, and of course, the reason why you would have those tools and the reason why you would use them is because there are dangers related to gambling, and addiction is exactly that danger. You are, maybe at risk. So that is, if there was not such risk, there would have been no reason to use a limit, right?
Yeah. There, we're getting questions, which is good. Yes, Jonathan?
I think as far as the research goes, and particularly looking at other areas of addiction, wherever possible, it should be personally relevant. So generic statements about things being addictive, it may be that it may be helpful, but really what tends to have an impact, and obviously what the gambling industry are quite good at doing at the minute, is giving them personally relevant information, again, in terms of detection tools, risk detection, personalized feedback. I think that tends to be the most effective for getting them to make decisions about responsible gambling.
For sure. If a person is spending too much time with their money, you should suggest a time limit, not a deposit limit. I think that makes it more personalized. Simo, since you've been quiet, the next question will be directed to you. But I know you're used to being on panels, so it's fine. We got a question saying, we are a licensed operator using an app where players can play. How can we best educate our players in the app about the use of our range of RG tools?
Hi, and again, thanks for having me on. Good to be here. A lot of what the panel are saying resonates, and so personalization through the app. Yeah, I'm just going to build on what the other guys have said. I feel that personalization works. There's a reason why, big tech companies are very successful because they personalize the customer experience, and yeah, there are for sure opportunities with responsible gambling. So I think, Maris, you touched upon it earlier. The idea that it's good to have sort of personalization, being able to assess risk, being able to flag players. I think that's sort of in place and being used broadly across the industry. But rather than just sort of a generic responsible gambling message, or as you say, the deposit limit prompt, I think it helps if you can unpack what it is that's driving the risk, so you can personalize the suggestions. So a really good example, as we've been talking, deposit limits are useful if people are increasing their deposit limits. People are increasing their deposits and they don't have a deposit limit, then prompting them to set something would be sensible. Likewise, as you said, Maris, if somebody is on a sort of a losing streak, setting their deposit limit might not help them. It might just help them continue to lose. What they may need is a loss limit. I know that's not always mandatory or even offered in many markets, but that could be quite useful if people can sort of put a break on that, or even a pause in play if their losses have racked up. So I feel that that's the opportunity in terms of taking what Edward said was standard tools that have been around for many years and making them more useful, as Jonathan said, context, personalization. So this is possible. We know it's possible. The industry spends a lot of money and effort in personalizing the gaming experience across all customer touch points. So there's absolutely opportunities, here. I remember when I was at Playtech, and we were using BetBuddy. We ran campaigns, RG campaigns on the marketing platform, and we saw sort of what I would consider useful outcomes. So 15% of people who were prompted to set a deposit limit when they did things that looked like they may benefit from one. So, for example, the campaign would, for example, say, if a player doesn't have a voluntary deposit limit, if they've deposited X amount, if they redeposit in a session, if they have another sign of risk, suggest something. And, if 15% of people take that up, I think that's reasonably successful. So we've definitely seen, and I think that probably explains the statistics you talked about earlier, Maris, is sort of, this 37% voluntary uptake of tools, a 14% increase on the year before. So there's clearly something working in terms of, as Eduard was saying, raising awareness and then trying to get people to use them. So for sure, apps are perfect for that. In-app messaging and prompts are really useful because it all happens in that environment on the phone, and that's a good way to do this, I think.
So We did get a few comments. I'm just going to highlight them for the sake of the discussion. So we have a comment which says like a dedicated RG hub with well-organized contact would really help people with external links as well when available. I mean, you would think that this is what we should do, but I've seen a lot of bad RG pages. And also someone else commented that it would be good to have an animated short video explaining how safer gambling tools work. I remember at one point, Bwin, I think, had this really good video on their RG page. And it was really good to see because now people are looking as well more to videos. And it was mentioned as well, like make it available as a course that they can take. So when seeing these approaches, for example, and Jonathan, I'm going to pass on to you. So for example, having like an animated short video to explain these things. Do you have any examples of how technology can drive new approaches to safer gambling and tools?
There. Thanks, Maris. I think when it comes to blue sky thinking, it's always tricky, isn't it? There's so many different options. I think one of the ones that kind of combines technological innovation and theoretical innovation is looking at situational risk profiles. So we're making a lot of progress looking at individual risk profiles. And when we talk about responsible gambling tools, safer gambling tools, what are we essentially talking about? We're talking about promoting self-control. And self-control, in terms of the latest psychological research, is essentially considered to be like a muscle or limited resource. So it means it can get tired out. So what does that mean? Well, at the player specific risk level, there's a variety of different things that affect self-control, personality traits, dopamine dysfunction, certain areas of the brain like the prefrontal cortex. But there's also a lot of research about how a situation can affect self-control. So the big ones tend to be sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, chronic and acute stress, alcohol is a big one, negative mood, frustration, depression. Now, those are situational and can essentially, even though we know that there are certain personal risk profiles, there are situations that can potentially apply to everybody. So even somebody who doesn't normally have a problem in certain situations may lose control. So if we're looking at promising areas to think about for new approaches, it would be trying to look at how we can use technology, AI, interactive opportunities to try to understand the situations in which players play, which might be good for interactions and interventions. So, and there's lots of ways you could do it. So a simple way to do it is, although it might be seen as slightly disruptive, sometimes disruption in player protection is a good thing. You want to get their attention. So it could be something very simple like, emojis, how tired are you? How is your mood at the start of the session? And immediately you get a lot of information about whether that player is going to be at increased risk based on that model of self-control. And of course, AI can do it. And there's some very simple things. I mean, playing late at night at 3 a.m. would be an obvious one for sleep deprivation, or playing 1 a.m. on New Year's Eve might be something that indicates the potential for alcohol. But of course, there's more sophisticated ways to do it. But if we're looking at newer ways to think about it, there are lots of opportunities to look at the situation and the context, this point that Simo raised earlier, rather than just the player. So that's one option.
Really interesting. I never thought about that actually. I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in to what Jonathan said. Yes, Simo?
Yeah, no, just to add another perspective on what Jonathan said, because if we're talking about innovation and tech, I think one of the things that both Stacy and Ed earlier talked about the usefulness of deposit limits as a really useful tool and activity statements. But we know that one of the downsides of that is with an operator is it's sort of contained within that single operator view. And I'm sort of interested in their views on how open they are to sort of thinking broader, in terms of would they like to see, if the deposit limits are the most useful, how could you extend them across multiple operators? Likewise with activity statements, how useful would it be for an operator to see activity across other operators in terms of unearthing that? There's obviously single customer view, open banking, and different technologies that could provide those opportunities. So yeah, so no, I'd be interested to sort of get an operator view on the pros and cons, I guess.
There is discussion in the Netherlands of having cross-operator limits, for example.
Exactly. There is a conversation. In fact, I think that conference we attended in September, Maris, in Rome, there was the KSA representatives that explained in much detail. I have to say they were not shy to present the entire presentation about their logic of how they propose a set mandatory deposit limits for the operators. And the only problem, of course, was, as Simo was just mentioned, is that those limits at this stage are not going to work across the network. So the limit is individual to every single operator, which one can say, well, makes less sense. Let's put it mildly, because if you're making your calculation that someone should be spending, a certain percentage of their income on entertainment, but then you allow that percentage to be spent across 50 different operators, that's time 50. So that doesn't simply add up. But honestly speaking, from my point of view, I would definitely welcome the cross-operator cooperation here, and I'm sure Stacy would be able perhaps to give a little bit more context on that new project that there is in the UK now, on sharing that data. It's not exactly about the tools, but it's a very similar approach, right? But the last thing I will say here is that from my point of view, of course, that decision is the decision that should be taken by the government and by the regulator. The level, that type of level of protection there, it's really a social policy of the country there, and I don't think I'm qualified enough then to even comment on those things. So, but clearly, so in any case, it shouldn't be up to operators freestyling so much.
Stacy, would you like
Yeah.
to chip in?
Yeah, I agree with that point, and I think then the point about like levels of privacy of us being able to see full data that across different areas. I think you get into those kind of areas as well. So I guess to Ed's point, that's further kind of discussion. But to the point about the in the UK at the minute, there's sort of the GAM Protect scheme, which is sort of in its pilot or had been in its pilot stage, and then I'm hoping to get rolled out further, which is sharing data, but it's a specific use case at the minute for extreme marks of harm. So where customers have closed and declared that it's for problem gambling reasons. So that's the starting point, first use case of that, being able to share that that information, as in the flags, I guess, are shared between operators there. So that is a step in that direction. But how that goes beyond there, I think, to Ed's point, that's a wider kind of discussion, policy, etc.
But we have to say, Simo, that is a very good point, because I have one more little thing to say. As a part of my duty at Betsson, what I do an induction training to all employees, everyone who starts, software developers, coordinators, analysts, management, doesn't matter. They all go through an induction, and they all spend 1 hour with me on the RG topic. And they have the opportunity to ask questions. And I swear to all of you, I get one question every other week I do that training. It's every 2 weeks I do that training. I do it for the last 6-7 years. I probably trained hundreds, if not thousands of people that has went through it. And there is one question that I get asked almost every single one. And the question is, but how is that those tools that you're offering, those exclusions and timeouts and limits, can I exclude with you and play with your competitor? Well, the answer is yes, you can. And people sometimes, especially the newbies that have not been exposed to gambling industry, they say, but that makes no sense whatsoever. What is this? Are you not sharing this data? It's very tough to share this data, and even the GAM Protect project took quite a while Lots of data sharing concerns, lots of GDPR concerns, lots of agreements about how you interpret this data, how you share it. On a surface, it seems very simple. Someone reports a problem, you put it inside. But, there are people who may not report it directly, but, in a very mild way. And then you start assuming some things and, it becomes complex. So, but this is clearly where in my view, this is clearly where the industry needs to go, and this is clearly what we need to be discussing, because as I said, this is something that is on people's mind. This is something that people are curious about, and this is something that outsiders, frankly, don't understand much.
And thanks, Stacy and Ed, for the answers. I really appreciate that. I think it's important to be honest, and that's a good point, Ed. That for someone outside the industry, it's like, well, it's so obvious, you should just do it. It's like it's a no-brainer, but actually, it is actually quite complex, and we don't have time to go into all of the complexities. But just the simple challenge, which is like if you delegate responsibility to some supercomputer or organization, what does that mean for all the good work that Flutter and Betsson and all the other operators are doing internally? What is the motivation to keep innovating and pushing and training and developing things if something else is going to solve the problem for you? And we know that silver bullets don't exist, and this is clearly in the silver bullet realm, and we're unpeeling the layers and realizing it's harder than we probably think. But I wanted to put it out there because I know it's topical and it's a complex problem. And I think as an industry, we have to find ways to try and sort of solve these problems together.
And there's a comment actually from the audience that says, on Simo's comment about cross-provider deposit limits like they exist in Germany, are there concerns that there would be commercial interest on seeing where players are playing? Wouldn't it otherwise require an anonymous data-protected approach? I don't know if you want to add something more to it, because I think we covered it a bit already.
I've heard anecdotally that the process in Germany is a bit clunky and cumbersome, and but I don't want to. I haven't looked in detail. That's just what I've heard, sort of on the grapevine. I do think there are the unintended consequences. You have the good intention of, say, implementing something, but what's to stop? If there was, let's just say we had a single deposit limit implemented, I'm pretty sure every operator will do everything they can to get their customers to deposit that, on day one of the month. So it's it will create another problem potentially, and not that it can't be solved, but I'm just saying that it's not always as simple as it looks. But I like the idea of exploring these new innovations and new ways of doing things, because there probably is a solution somewhere out there. We just probably haven't put enough collective thought and testing and problem solving into it yet.
There is a question from the audience which is also quite similar to one of our prepared questions. So going to Stacy now. So the question is, has the effectiveness of this type of game control tools been proven, particularly in players who have already developed an addiction problem? I think it's a bit hard to just focus on the people who have developed an addiction problem with this, because if they're addicted, we don't want them playing with an operator. But maybe you can explain a bit on how do you define effectiveness in the context of the safer gambling tools? Maybe what metrics you use to measure that they're actually effective.
Yeah, sure. So I think, like Simo mentioned, the kind of silver bullet sort of angle earlier, and I think this also kind of falls in that kind of realm, in that with a lot of things in the kind of safety space, it's complex, right? And I think it's hard to define one singular outcome that we could then hold up as an absolute definitive measure of success. So at Flutter UK and Ireland, we use a range of different measures that we track. So both in terms of effectiveness of tools, but also looking at our customer safety initiatives across the board. So globally, as part of the Flutter kind of play well strategy, the aim we have there is for all players to use tools. We've talked before about, be part of education and preventative tools, etc. So not just tools for customers that may be deemed as high risk. So we have long-term targets around tool usage. So to have 75% of players using tools by 2030. And also that kind of works as a bit of an overarching North Star target that's easy to understand for colleagues, helps them kind of think about how they can help to drive that number as well. But, it needs to be meaningful, right? So we don't want customers just to sign up, use the tool once and then take it off so that you've kind of hit that number. So they need to continue to kind of use them month in and month out to help them with supporting their play. And that's how we actually track that percentage at month on month. And then I think, more broadly than just beyond whether people are actually using the tools is then kind of considering, well, how are they working? So, how is that, impacting their kind of play sort of afterwards? So I guess linking the behaviour then to the kind of specific function of the tool that's being put on and the outcomes that we'd like to see from that and from the customers using them. But again, I think you have to think about the context in which the tools are set or used. We've talked before about the kind of voluntary versus operator kind of set sort of angle to tools on accounts, and that changes the lens a little, I think. So, if you have early adoption, voluntary adoption of the tool, you're effectively making the same tool preventative, whereas if the operator's putting it on, can be restrictive. So you kind of then, that's the other kind of context, I guess, in thinking about the kind of impact or the effectiveness. So as an operator, if we've set a tool on a customer's account, we've set a financial limit, so we'd be looking then to see a reduction in spend kind of moving forward. Any kind of time limits then leading to a reduction in time, essentially seeing a decrease in harmful behaviours or a return to the levels that we might have seen before the customer's been identified for review. And then from the customer-led sort of lens, it's around thinking about creating sustainable play and how you reducing churn. Customers are still staying with you and having longer tenure, I guess, with you long term.
That's a very good point, because that can help commercially as well, because it's always a struggle with commercial and safer gambling.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is in terms of kind of culturally as well, kind of getting people to think that. There was a town hall session yesterday where one of the CCOs of one of the brands kind of made the point that we want customers to stay with us for 10 years, not 10 minutes. So it's that kind of link to things and how you're looking at that more in the long term. And then I do had another couple of things, I think, just in terms of tracking. So we look at also other things like to look at measuring levels of risk. So we look at self-exclusion rates. Looking at the proportion of revenue that comes from customers that then go on to exclude. So similar, I think, like to the Journey to Zero sort of Kindred stuff, Maris, I think in that sort of sense at looking at revenues there. And then, from looking at that information, we have seen direct links between tool usage and then a reduction in self-exclusion. So we had an example of that a few years ago when we introduced mandatory limits on customers coming back from an exclusion. So we could see then the impact on the re-exclusion rate in customers kind of moving forward. So that's a measure, I guess, that we can look at as well. But we know self-exclusion's got its limitations also. So we also look at things like self-assessment through PGSI, positive play scale, and things like that. And just customer sentiment, so tracking like how customers feel about tools. So through kind of customer research that we do, so I'll ask questions, that they make it easy for me to gamble safely. They have a range of tools that can help people stay in control. So no like one simple kind of answer to it. I guess there's lots of things that we can and that we do track. And I think, as well, definitely like there's lots more to kind of learn in that space. So, we've got plans to do further work in developing metrics moving forward. And I think it's important to learn from others, collaborate on what works, both as we consider developing any new tools or promoting, enhancing the existing ones that we've got.
I don't know if Edward, you want to chip in, because I'm sure that you also measure effectiveness.
Well, I'm very much. I just don't want to repeat what Stacy said, because literally I could probably just repeat almost every single word of that, and it would be very much of a repetition. We do very, very similar things that we do, and very similar metrics. Obviously, the adoption of self-exclusions and the timeouts and the limits and all those things. The only thing I could say, which I find quite interesting, perhaps from my experience and from the statistics we explore and we see at Betsson, I have to say that out of all the markets where there are where the deposit limit is not mandatory, but the voluntary, I think the United Kingdom has always been the top market, number one, across all our portfolio with the highest adoption rate of deposit limits in a voluntary setting. Of course, I'm taking out those markets where the limits are mandatory. So if I compare the United Kingdom with any other market across the globe that I had any kind of contact with, in the UK, it's always been the highest. It is the highest at this point, at least for us as the group. And I think that part of that answer why is so is actually the awareness and the education and the understanding of the industry, which is higher in the United Kingdom versus many other jurisdictions. And the difference is substantial, very substantial. We're talking about 5 times higher, sometimes 4 times higher. So I'm not talking about a couple percentage points. I'm talking literally about a completely different outlook there.
Yes, Jonathan?
Just a very quick point. So it's absolutely right. I think that the absence of harm, the reduction of harm is the priority, and we still have to crack that nut. If we're looking towards the future, I think what we should be trying to also do is have a more global measure of well-being. So not just the absence and reduction of harm, but the presence of consumer benefit. And I don't think positive play necessarily fulfills that criteria. So, for example, Maris, the work that we do with you on need satisfaction, there's certain psychological needs the players get when they participate. So we don't have time to go into it now, but it's just keeping an open mind about when we're interested in the well-being of the player, it's not just the absence of harm, but also what they're getting out of it and what kind of leisure benefits they might get out of it too. So it's just worth thinking about that as we move forward.
For
That's
sure.
definitely something that we want to think about moving forward, Jonathan. I think that, like, exactly that point, like, how do you kind of shift the lens, or how do you think about the kind of the whole journey? And it's not just about the reduction of harm, it's the well-being across the experience and across the scale.
Because technically, if someone is registering and setting up a limit, there's no harm at the time. It could be just the responsible gamblers, you know, they know that they're taking care of it. I think there's such a spectrum of customers that we need to also consider that. I'm going to try and we're getting a lot of questions, which is good, but I'm getting cross-eyed. I'm just going to combine 2 questions and direct them to you, Simo. So, like, I want to go more about what role do data analytics and AI can help with developing more adaptive and personalized safer gambling tools. But it was also mentioned, and I know through BetBuddy you would have this experience, like how can we, what can we do in order not just for the detection of early signs of problematic gambling, so markers of harm with AI, but also tailoring interventions about it. And in fact, someone else also asked to see how can we, what are the ideas if someone is a bit more in denial, what can we do there? So quite a big topic. I don't know if Simo, you want to try?
Yeah, we have touched upon this earlier in the discussion, the sort of the personalization. So I won't repeat what I said then, but I do believe in it. I do believe it's a big part of making the tools useful. I'll go a little bit off tangent and and say, look, we've talked a lot about sort of tools and sort of safer gambling, and that's all important. But it still feels to me that they're a little bit separate from the gaming experience. So it's still, it's part of the site where you go and you set the limits and you have to be prompted to do it, and it's a tool and it's responsible gambling. So it still, for me, feels like there's an opportunity to rethink how can it be embedded more seamlessly in the customer experience so that there's less thinking on behalf of the customer to have to think about to do it, that the operator can sort of intelligently think on behalf of the customer and say, well, based on our immense experience and all our data, and we know how people gamble, okay, everyone's individual, but we know how people gamble. We think this kind of setup is probably optimized for you as a player, but you don't sort of tell them to go in and set the limits and the times and this and that, and is it daily, is it weekly, is it monthly, and blah blah blah, and do I switch off advertising, do I keep it on? It's kind of done in the background, and it's kind of seamless, so that the concept of tools and RG is less obvious, but more sort of kind of embedded in the experience. So clearly AI and machine learning and personalization can go a long way in helping to do that. But it's just a different take on the term tools and responsible gambling. We will do, as an operator, we will do what we can to put everything in place for you so that this remains entertainment. Now, I love the auto industry. You know, we were talking about this the other day. I think they've taken car safety and the features and tools to another level. I absolutely love the fact that new cars have all of this great stuff built in, and it's there for you. And you know, there are times when I'm driving, you know, I've got wife to my left, I've got the kids in the back, they're one's 3, one's 8. It's a long journey, there's a lot of chatter, there's a lot of shouting and fighting. You know, I'm on the motorway, it's busy. That lane assist is actually quite useful. That adaptive cruise control is actually quite useful. It helps me out because I sometimes lose track of where I am, and I'm saying, stop hitting her, or this, or I'm talking about something with my wife, and I need the voice control to tell me. So that's all built in for me. It's thinking on my behalf. I really like that. There are times when I'm on my own in the car and I'm on a B road, I'm in the countryside, I can switch it off and I can drive the car as the car needs to be driven, because I know that I'm fully concentrating on my surroundings, where I am as I take the bends, who's behind me, who's in front of me. And I just feel that that could be the future, where it's built in, it's less obvious, it's personalized, it's adaptive, but ultimately the player can sort of control it. So I'm sorry, I probably went off a bit of a tangent there, Maris, but I didn't want to repeat what I said earlier, but I feel that could be a vision for the future. But hey, I'm a dreamer. What can I say?
I think you're a dreamer because you haven't driven in Malta, though, because I can't imagine having any good smart system for here. And in fact, it does tie into one of the questions that we have, because obviously we're talking about safer gambling tools that the operator is offering. But like in the auto example, I mentioned external. So what about the other drivers and how people drive in Malta and stuff? And in fact, one of the questions is, I think we also need to think about the black market. So the question says, having a system such as GAM Protect enforced on the licensed operators will lead customers to use unlicensed websites, essentially not solving the issue of problem gambling, but shifting the visibility on it. I don't know who wants to answer this. So the question says, like, what do you think about this?
I'm doing a little bit of work with the regulator in the UK on the illegal market, and all I can say is, yes, this is the challenge a regulator has: is how do you get the balance right? Protect the consumer, do everything we can to protect them, but also don't make the experience so restrictive or unexciting that they want to go elsewhere. And we do know, actually, the other options that are not regulated, that the copycats are quite good, so you can get good content and good sites that are unregulated. And then also you have other gambling opportunities that are kind of not necessarily copycats, but still potentially attractive crypto casinos. So I don't think there's unfortunately, as we know, there are no silver bullets. It's lots of super focused activity from the regulator, from the operators working together, trying to disrupt it from all angles. Again, we don't have the time to go into it, but it will always be there. The challenge is, what can we do collectively to minimize the activity in the illegal market?
Anyone else wants to chip in on this? No?
Well, I think what Simo said is very accurate, and for sure it's just a matter of finding the balance. I don't think any regulator's intention is to grow the black market. Clearly, it's the opposite. It's the question of how you find that balance in your policy. And there was an example of Germany as well being mentioned, and I think that limit framework that works across the operators perhaps is and is a little bit shaky there and not super clear and has their downsides, I think, is one of the factors perhaps why that black market in Germany is also substantial based on that research that we have seen at least. So if you just need to be fine tuning those elements and you need to find those breaking points or and you need to research what actually helps. We have another example of some COVID measures in Sweden. I'm sure we all aware about mandatory limits across, and it certainly did not help. And I think the common knowledge at this point in 2024 is that they indeed did not help. And the government, I think, has partly also admitted that it was a challenge really, and clearly not something that has contributed. So we just need to be finding those elements of regulation and pinpointing them and fine tuning them, making sure that they do not break that journey and they don't destroy the entire experience of the players, no matter how much we want to protect them, because that's exactly what we want to do. But we cannot uh, we cannot overdo it either.
We have a question which is more around research, so I'm going to look at you, Jonathan. So the question comes saying, like, is there maybe, it's not an easy one, is there a must-read study on the use of responsible gambling tools, or maybe some studies or researchers that they can follow?
It's a really good question. From my understanding, the simple answer is no. I think it's an area that we are not very good collectively as an industry at looking at. I mean, quite often one of the things people talk about is what are the big challenges when it comes to advancing safer gambling tools. I think the problem of evaluation and learning and disseminating what we're learning collectively as a group of stakeholders is something that we don't do very well. So I think most of us are familiar with lots of in-house research that operators are doing, some really good stuff. So it's about that next step of putting it down in a written report, possibly getting it peer reviewed, possibly trying to disseminate it. And one of the things that we should even consider, and I would pitch now, is what about an industry journal for safer gambling studies or something like that? Doesn't necessarily have to be an academic output, but it could be peer reviewed. And it's funny because I think that journal would be criticized quite heavily for being biased. But I bet you one thing, I bet you the research that comes out of it will be very heavily used and relied upon for advancing knowledge. So, kind of flipping the question on its head a little bit, I think there's a lot of new information, new insights that are being generated that aren't being harnessed properly. I mean, maybe need to think of a way to do that better. And the reason that peer review helps, not only does it help a little bit in managing, is this good research? I know that quite often operators might be concerned, have they done this right? Because quite often they might do something quickly to try to learn because they're having to, unlike us academics, they actually have to apply this research quite quickly. So the peer review process might help there as well. So I don't know, something to consider, I think.
Yeah, you could have kept that for yourself and made money out of it as well, but
I'm all about helping people.
So yes, Stacy?
As you said, all for the greater good, Jonathan.
Yeah.
But no,
Yeah.
that's a really good idea. Yeah.
It is a really good idea because I think making research accessible sometimes and even understandable, and we both know, like, sometimes in the peer review process, you can tell some of the reviewers don't have really like any idea of gambling, so we have to answer some.
But Jonathan, no academic would ever reference the industry journal. You know how these things work out. So you'll end up having the two tracks. You'll have the pure academics who will be in their ivory tower, who will reference each other and say, this is pure, it's academic. You have the industry who will be like, well, this is real and applied, but no one will trust each other. So,
but I would bet that the key groups that really matter when it comes to decision making, government regulators would use the industry one over the lab-based studies, the academics that are still studying near misses from 20 years ago. I might be wrong, I don't know, but I think I think there's a lot of really, really good insights out there. And at the very least, I would imagine that some of the brighter academics that don't want to have anything to do with industry would at least look at that for ideas about their next academic studies that they can get all the glory from whenever it gets properly cited. But I don't know, at the very least, even if it's just shared and not referenced in academic research, it'd be useful.
I
it's a
think
good
so.
Yeah,
idea.
I wouldn't advise an academic who's trying to build their career to use that approach. That's very true.
I mean, we've had research where we quoted like sustainability reports from the industry, so why not?
I
We
mean,
only have,
I have,
yes,
sorry, I was going to say I have tried to influence regulators with work that I've done within industry, but ultimately the pushback is is it published, which, is it in the gold standard of peer review? And we know the industry is not so great at doing that. So I think that's a barrier to influencing a lot of the policymakers, but maybe a discussion for another day.
maybe something that we can plan on with this new publication. We only have 4 minutes left. So a very short comment by each. Anything you want to add on, maybe some like advice for people who work in this area to look at innovations or best practices. I start off with Stacy.
Sorry, just finding I mean, I've spent so many years using conferencing software and still can't find the mute button. So I think, yeah, we've touched on it a few times, during the conversation, but I think the point around kind of education, the personalization of things for customers, to try and, make them aware of tools and why they might be relevant to them. We've always, like, for years called it the safer gambling paradox that we've struggled with, in terms of, lots of people say, yes, safer gambling is great, operators should do it, etc. But it's not for me. I don't have a problem. It's people with problems. So it's how do you think about, like, weaving things throughout the journey, so it's not just off to the side. It's, how do you just make it part of the whole experience and an enhancement to the general playing experience for people. So kind of less about, to Ed's point right at the beginning, less about necessarily coming up with fancy new tools, more just about embedding and understanding for the players that are using them.
Thank you. Ed, very short comment.
Yeah, very much agree with Stacy on her statement. I think we're all aligned here, and even from the other speakers as well. And if we look in the future, I guess also in line with what Simo was saying, machine learning is probably going to play a role there, perhaps a bit less in the initial stages of customer identification purely, but more into the interaction stages and possibly also the evaluation stages, because also let's not forget, we touched upon that briefly, but that is the area where I think operators are struggling perhaps the most, is really understanding the value and understanding the outcomes and putting together, because one thing is to look at the statistics and the rates that are changing, but another thing is to really draw sensible and important conclusions there. So
Thank you. Jonathan, very quickly.
I guess just very quickly, one of the key points I'd make is we talked a lot about the future, about innovations. Be a little bit of party pooper and just point out I think there's still a lot of the basics that we're not getting right. And Maris, you mentioned one of them at the start. So I still think when you look at a lot of websites, it is risky rather than protective choice architecture. I mean, we when you look at the website, it's still really easy to deposit, one click, and if you want to withdraw money, it's 2, 3, or 4 clicks. You made the point about where the safer gambling page is. There's still some that are not just small print, but way at the bottom of the page. Gamification. There's a long list of things that, and again, this doesn't apply to all operators. I mean, a lot of really, really good choice architecture, website design, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, focusing on some of the more basic design issues is also important to do as well.
Simo, you have 30 seconds.
Okay. What can I say? I mean, just to sort of reiterate some of the things Stacy and Ed have been talking about in terms of, a lot of great work on outputs and outcomes and all the KPIs and metrics. It's turning that lens onto the impact. So, okay, we're doing all this stuff, we're measuring all this stuff, we're getting all these KPIs. Ultimately, is it making a difference, and trying to really sort of zero in on that. So outcome metrics, very important. That we need to report them, but really the impact. And if we can focus on that and get some evidence and data to support the impact this is all having in reducing harms, then I think that would put the industry in a strong place.
Thank you. We're just on time, so I'd just like to thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. An hour flew by. Thanks for everyone who sent so many questions. That's really good. I'm sorry we couldn't cover them all. The video recording will be sent to you tomorrow via email. And just to remind you that there are more events seeing it's Safer Gambling Week, so you can check out the agenda on the EGBA website. And on Friday, I'll be moderating another panel about RG messaging. So anyone who's interested and who's not bored of my voice can join that on Friday as well. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Maris. Thanks all.
Thank you all.